I never thought anyone could reach me. At 27, I had walls higher than mountains, guarded, bruised by heartbreak, and sure love wasn't for me. I thought I was invisible. But then he walked in, a billionaire, older, unexpected, and somehow he saw me, really saw me. If you love stories of unexpected love, resilience, and finding yourself again, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing your stories too. I was 27, a black woman with a life I had built carefully, brick by brick, yet always alone. Independent, ambitious, and determined, I had worked my way into a career that demanded everything from me, but gave little in return, at least in terms of emotional satisfaction. My apartment was modest, quiet, and exactly the way I liked it, but some nights the silence pressed in on me, reminding me of all the connections I had lost along the way. I had learned early on that trusting someone with your heart was dangerous, and I had paid for it more times than I could count. Betrayal wasn't a story I heard. It was a story I lived. Men I had loved or thought I loved had proven themselves to be unreliable, selfish, or simply unworthy of the depth I had offered. Each disappointment left a scar, and with each scar, I built a wall taller, stronger, and harder to climb. It wasn't that I had given up on love entirely. I just had stopped expecting it to be anything more than fleeting, something fragile that could be shattered at any moment. And honestly, that was safer. Safer to guard myself, safer to focus on me, and safer to live without the heartbreak that seemed inevitable. People saw me as confident, as someone who had it all together, but beneath that exterior, I carried a quiet loneliness that I rarely let anyone glimpse. My evenings were spent with work deadlines, the glow of my laptop, and the hum of the city outside my window. I walked to work most days, not because I loved the exercise, but because it gave me a few quiet moments to think, to breathe, to process the constant hum of my life that didn't leave much room for anyone else. Dating apps? I had tried them, of course, like everyone else, but they were exhausting, draining, and often disappointing. Endless swipes and shallow conversations reminded me that most men weren't looking for anything serious, or worse, they weren't looking for me. So I stopped. I stopped hoping for someone to understand the complexities I carried, the mix of ambition and vulnerability, the deep desire to be seen and yet the fear of being hurt again. My world became a careful rhythm of work, home, and quiet reflection, a life where I controlled everything I could, except the one thing that mattered most, my heart. And yet, despite the walls I built, despite the careful boundaries I kept, I didn't feel invincible. There were moments, fleeting as they were, when I longed for connection, for someone who could see past the independence and the walls, someone who could reach me in a way no one else had. But those moments were rare, fleeting whispers in my otherwise structured life. I had learned to survive, to thrive even, but I had never truly let someone in, not fully. My life was safe, predictable, and solitary, and I had convinced myself that it was enough. Until, of course, that carefully constructed world was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. I first noticed him on a day that felt entirely ordinary, the kind of day where nothing remarkable should happen. I was walking through the small downtown cafe I frequented, my laptop tucked under my arm, headphones in, lost in my own little world of deadlines and lists. He was there, of course, but I didn't notice him at first. Not really. Just a man standing by the counter, calm, patient, reading something on his phone, completely unaware of anyone around him. There was a quiet confidence about him, the kind that doesn't shout for attention but somehow commands it anyway. And maybe it was the way he smiled at the barista, polite, unassuming, but somehow genuine, that made me glance up just for a second. I felt a strange pull, an unexpected curiosity that I quickly tried to suppress. I wasn't interested, at least that's what I told myself. I had my walls, my carefully maintained routines, and my history of heartbreaks that made me wary of even casual conversations. But as I moved toward my usual corner, I noticed him glance my way, almost imperceptibly, with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. I shook my head and muttered under my breath, "No, not today," and tried to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of tapping keys and caffeine-induced focus. And then he spoke. Just a simple, casual question. "Is this seat taken?" I looked up, startled, not because of the question itself, but because there was something in the way he asked it, soft yet steady, like he already knew the answer didn't matter as much as starting the conversation. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to engage, unsure if I could let my guard down even for a moment, but something in his presence, something inexplicable, made me nod. "No, it's fine," I muttered, my voice quieter than I intended. The first few minutes were awkward, but not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind of awkward that sparks a curiosity, a tension that makes you wonder if something unexpected might happen. He didn't pry, he didn't ask for my life story, or try to charm me with clever lines. Instead, he simply talked about small things: the weather, the book he was reading, the aroma of the coffee around us. It was banal, but somehow it felt real. I found myself smiling, resisting the urge to roll my eyes at how easily he'd broken through the invisible bubble I had wrapped around myself. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just one of those moments that feels larger than it really is. Yet, as he laughed at a joke he didn't even need to make, I realized that I hadn't felt this scene in a long time. Not by anyone, not truly. I could feel my walls, those invisible barriers I had spent years reinforcing, trembling ever so slightly. And yet, even with that trembling, I reminded myself I was not going to let anyone in. I had been hurt before. I had learned that closeness came with risk, and risk always had a price. But as he spoke, I caught glimpses of something unexpected: gentleness, a sense of patience that contradicted the brashness I had come to expect from men. He didn't push, didn't insist, didn't make me feel like I owed him a part of me I wasn't ready to give. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first thing that made him dangerous. The way he didn't seem dangerous at all. The more I listened, the more I felt a subtle shift inside myself. Something I hadn't allowed in years stirred. Quietly, insistently, curiosity, a fragile, almost forbidden hope that maybe, for the first time in a long time, I could let someone walk into the room of my life without breaking it apart. Over the next few weeks, he kept appearing, not in a pushy, overwhelming way, but in that subtle, deliberate way that made it impossible to ignore him. Sometimes it was in the cafe again, sometimes outside my favorite bookstore, and once even on the crowded street when I had convinced myself no one could possibly know where I'd be. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, fate, maybe. But as the days passed, it became clear he was paying attention, not just to me, but to the small details of my life I tried to hide. He noticed how I always ordered the same coffee, the way I lingered near the window when I needed a quiet moment, and even the books I carried. Nothing about him screamed wealth or status. He was unassuming, casual, calm. And yet, there was a presence in him that made the world feel smaller, softer, like for those few moments when he was near, everything else faded away. I kept my guard high, of course. I wasn't going to fall into some fairy tale or naive hope. I had survived heartbreaks, betrayals, and lies, and I wasn't about to forget those lessons. But still, something about him lingered. He had a way of making me feel acknowledged without forcing me to share more than I wanted. He didn't bombard me with questions or demand my attention. Instead, he offered small gestures, bringing an extra pastry when he knew I forgot my lunch, offering a quiet smile when our eyes met across the cafe, or leaving a simple note that said, "Thinking of you." It wasn't grandiose, it wasn't flashy, but it was enough to crack open the walls I had spent so long reinforcing. I couldn't understand why I let myself notice these things. I didn't want to be weak, didn't want to hope, but I couldn't deny the pull, an inexplicable curiosity that made me wonder who he really was beneath the calm exterior. There were quiet moments when he'd share something fleeting about his life, and I found myself listening more closely than I had with anyone in years. He spoke without arrogance, with a sincerity that made me question everything I had told myself about men, about love, about trust. And slowly, imperceptibly, I began to look forward to seeing him. I caught myself checking the cafe schedule, hoping for the chance encounter. My heart, the part I thought was dormant and protected, began to remember what it felt like to notice someone, to anticipate a smile or a kind word. I hated that he was doing this to me, yet I couldn't stop it. He was patient, never forcing, always waiting just outside the reach of my fear. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, someone could reach me without breaking me. But by waiting, by noticing, and by simply being present, there was a moment I'll never forget, the one that made me realize my walls were no longer impenetrable. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the city hums softly outside and the world feels paused, like it's holding its breath. He had invited me to walk with him after I'd run into him at the bookstore, and against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself it was harmless, just a stroll. But as we walked, something shifted. It wasn't the way he talked, or the way his hand brushed mine. It was the way he listened, really listened. Not the polite nodding that I had grown used to, but the deep, unwavering attention that made me feel as if my thoughts, my fears, my past mistakes were safe in his presence. I found myself telling him things I hadn't spoken aloud in years, about my heartbreaks, the betrayals that had carved scars across my heart, and the nights I spent wondering if love would ever find me again. I expected him to judge, to shrink back, to retreat into that polite distance people usually keep when confronted with another's pain. But he didn't. He absorbed it, held it gently between us like it was sacred, and responded not with empty words, but with understanding. He shared fragments of his own solitude, moments of loneliness that wealth and success couldn't erase, and I realized in that moment that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was connection. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Still, old habits die hard. When I later learned from someone else that he was a billionaire, my walls shot up again, higher than ever. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that his kindness, his attentiveness, was genuine regardless of wealth. But a small, stubborn voice whispered warnings I couldn't ignore. Men like him didn't need love the way I did. They had power, control, options, and I was just a fleeting interest if I allowed myself to believe otherwise. I tried to step back, to remind myself of all the reasons I had built these walls, to tell myself I wasn't ready to be seen this deeply by anyone. But every attempt to retreat felt heavier, more exhausting. He had a way of entering my life that wasn't forced or loud, but persistent in the most human way possible. He noticed when I was tired, when I hesitated, when I pulled away. He left little reminders of thoughtfulness, an unexpected message, a book he thought I'd like, a gentle comment about my laugh that made me blush despite myself. And slowly the cracks began to form. The walls I had fortified with fear and past pain were yielding, not because I allowed them to, but because he showed me that someone could respect, honor, and cherish all the complicated parts of me. There were nights when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, questioning whether I was being foolish. Could someone truly break through all of this? Or was I simply setting myself up to be hurt again? And yet, there was an undeniable pull, a yearning that was impossible to ignore. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every quiet understanding chipped away at the armor I had built. And with every chip, I realized something extraordinary. The walls I had erected weren't there to keep love out. They were there to protect me from being seen. And for the first time in years, I felt like someone might see me anyway and still stay. Just when I thought I could let myself feel, just when I thought maybe I could trust him, I panicked. My walls, the ones I had spent years reinforcing, suddenly felt both fragile and essential all at once. I pulled away, carefully, deliberately, convinced that if I let him too close, I would regret it. I told myself it wasn't him. It was me, my history, my fear of being hurt again. But the truth was simpler. I wasn't ready to surrender to anyone, no matter how patient, kind, or sincere they were. I had learned to survive alone, and survival had become comfortable, safe. I avoided him. I stopped responding to messages immediately, took longer walks to avoid chance encounters, and busied myself with work that demanded everything but left no space for vulnerability. Yet, even in avoidance, he persisted, not in a way that pressured me, not in a way that demanded or manipulated, but in a way that respected the walls I had erected. He left small, quiet reminders of his presence, subtle gestures that said, without words, "I'm here, but I won't force you." A book left on my doorstep with a note, a carefully timed message to check if I had eaten that day, a simple observation about something I mentioned in passing weeks ago. These small acts were gentle, consistent, and insistent in the most human way possible. At first, I hated them. I resented how easily they chipped away at the defenses I had so carefully built. I told myself he didn't understand me, that he didn't know what it meant to carry so much pain and mistrust. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the tug of curiosity, the subtle shift in my heart that made me reconsider. Was it possible that someone could be genuine without hidden agendas? Was it possible that someone could care for me without expecting something in return? I didn't want to hope, but the evidence was all around me. Finally, there came a moment I couldn't ignore. A note left at my apartment, so simple and unassuming, yet profoundly affecting. "I don't want to break your walls. I just hope you'll let me be in the spaces you choose to share." That was it. No grand gestures, no declarations, no pressure. Just a recognition of my fear, a respect for my boundaries, and a quiet invitation to let him in. Not forcefully, but patiently. I couldn't respond immediately. I sat with the note, held it close, and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in years, the fragile, tentative stirrings of trust. The test wasn't about him proving himself. It was about me deciding if I could risk being seen again, if I could allow myself to believe that someone could enter my life and stay without hurting me. And when I finally confronted him, asked him why he chose to stay despite my walls, he didn't speak of wealth or charm, nor did he promise to change anything about me. He simply said, "Because you're real, because I see you, all of you, and I want to be here, not for what you give me, but for who you are." In that moment, everything shifted. It wasn't magic, it wasn't instantaneous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was enough to make me realize that love, when patient and genuine, doesn't break you. It finds its way through the cracks, nurtures the fragile spaces, and waits for the moment you're ready to let it in. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if I could truly trust him, not just with moments, but with pieces of myself I had long thought untouchable. The moment I finally let him in felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping off a ledge into air I had long forgotten could exist. My walls, the ones I had built brick by brick, began to crumble, not because he forced them down, but because he had waited patiently and consistently, showing me that being seen didn't have to hurt. I realized, in a way I hadn't allowed myself before, that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the gateway to something profoundly human, something deeply real. It started with small gestures. Our conversations grew longer, more honest. I shared pieces of myself I had guarded fiercely, stories of heartbreak, fear, and loneliness that I had buried beneath layers of independence. And he listened, really listened. There was no judgment, no impatience, no rush to fix anything. Just presence, just him, right there, holding space for all the parts of me I had kept hidden. And as I shared, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years, a release from the constant vigilance that had defined my life. The first time I allowed myself to reach for his hand, it felt monumental, a simple gesture, but in that touch was an entire world of trust, hope, and the quiet surrender that comes from letting someone in when you've spent so long protecting yourself. He smiled gently, without words, and I realized he understood that this was more than affection. It was a breakthrough, a victory over the fear that had kept me isolated for so long. Being with him didn't erase the past, nor did it erase my independence, but it transformed it. I began to see that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that I didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. He didn't need me to be perfect, polished, or unbroken. He needed me to be real, and that realization, that simple truth, made all the difference. The walls weren't gone entirely. They weren't meant to be. They were reminders of my journey, of the strength it took to protect myself. But now they existed alongside trust, alongside love that had been earned, not forced. And in the quiet moments when we sat together and shared nothing more than a laugh or a gentle glance, I felt the kind of connection I had thought only existed in stories. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and powerful in the way that only genuine love can be. I had spent so long believing that being guarded was the only way to survive, but he showed me a different path, one where safety and intimacy could coexist, where love didn't demand surrender but encouraged growth. I finally understood what it meant to let someone see you fully and still be chosen, to let someone walk through the doors of your carefully controlled life and have them respect every step of the journey that brought you there. And as I held his hand that first time, I whispered silently to myself, I am ready, ready to trust, ready to love, and finally ready to believe that the walls I once built to protect myself could now stand as a foundation for something beautiful, enduring, and real. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that love can still find them. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever let someone break through your walls?